Bloomberg put me among the top 10 most influential policymakers in the world. I went to see them and asked the question, why did you put my name there and why not Obama? And the response was,
Welcome to the Game of Impossible podcast. My name is Leon. This is my dad, Idris Jala. We are a father and son podcast where we discuss all things transformation through the lens of business, leadership, sport, and faith as well. Right now, we are in an 8-part series called The Big Fast Results 8 Steps of Transformation. Dad, we covered the first step last week on the importance of setting a strategic direction through a strategic direction workshop. Step 2 is the labs. This is something that we talk a lot about in our organization, PEMANDU Associates. The labs cover a lot of the actual doing. So can you walk us through what the lab is? Why do we do labs?
yeah, a lab is a physical space where you get people from within an organization to come together to address two things. One is the true north that was set in step 1. And secondly, the initiative or the key priorities that were agreed in step 1 to break them down so that they become detailed enough for implementation. Those are the key reasons why, what do they do? That's what a lab. So again, to repeat, a lab is a physical environment where many different people in organizations gather together to address the true north and drill them down into the priorities that are identified in step 1. And that's a period that they will run this lab for altogether 6 weeks full time. We put people there, typically between about 50 people in a room. Every day, every morning, they turn up in that space. They analyze the problem. They look at the data, they debate solutions to it and argue and come with the best possible solutions. And I believe the labs that we've been conducting is the best opportunity for people to innovate, to come with completely radical ideas. And these ideas are normally not done in a normal setting, but in a lab, you'll find the best innovation actually come in the lab.
Yeah, it's important that we talk a little bit about why we think the labs require that amount of time. Voltaire, I think, said that no problem can withstand the assault of sustained thinking.
Yeah.
I think this is very much creating an environment for sustained thinking around a particular project or around a particular problem. And why does it require 6 weeks? 6 weeks is actually on the short side. We have done labs that have
8
gone
weeks.
way below.
Yeah, 8
beyond
weeks
that.
we've done that as well. When you say it is long, the time taken, and I would argue it is not. Normally, organization will take 6 months or 8 months to come with a plan. And if you ask me how long does it take a country to come with a strategic 10-year plan, they normally take 1 year or even 2 years to do it. In an organization, they take 12 months to go and do it. Now, what we're doing here, we're trying to condense that into just 6 weeks. And the reason why it takes that amount of time is this. However good a strategy is that is documented, and I would argue that strategies are developed and documented at 30,000 feet. They're very high level, but you don't implement strategies. You implement operational plans. So the lab is about turning those high level strategies into operational plan at 3 feet, it's what I call it. How do you know the plan is done at 3 feet? That means everyone who is on the list to execute any task for that key activities, you will know, and by tracking it, you can track the progress on a weekly basis. If you cannot track on a weekly basis, that you only can track the things that they do on a monthly basis or a quarterly basis, they are at best probably at 1,000 feet. They're not brought down to 3 feet. So you want to break them down to specific details. I give you a layman's example. If you have a strategy to build a house, and you come with a strategy and say, I want to build a beautiful house, the strategy, this house will be a house that has 4 rooms, 4 bedrooms, 1 living room, and 1 kitchen, and 1 library. And so go forth and build that. That is strategy. But you don't build it. don't build a house on the basis of a high level 30,000 feet strategy. That is a strategy. But in a lab, you bring everybody inside the room. In 6 weeks, they come with the detailed drawing, the architectural drawing, detailed engineering plan for it, the conceptual and detailed design for engineering, the procurement people identifying what needs to be bought, how many bricks need to be brought in to go and do this, who are the contractors to go and do it, what's the work schedule on week 1, week 2, week 3, for the whole year when you're building this. So an entire thing to build a house is done within 6 weeks. That's actually a very short period of time. The entire planning for building that house. And we're now saying if you want to do a turnaround for a whole company, even the whole of Malaysia, if you wanted to do an economic planning, and you can do it in 6 weeks, I would argue that 6 weeks is really, really very short. And that's why everyone who's been involved with me, when they go into the lab, they always say this, Leon. They always say, wow, you're asking us for such a long time. What are we going to do in the 6 weeks? I can guarantee you at every single lab that we conducted, whether it's in Malaysia, it's in Oman, in Nigeria, it's in New Zealand, whether it's in Russia, they all say 6 weeks is not enough. We need more time. But we tell them, no, you ain't got to have more time. We will ask you time box. 6 weeks, you have to have the discipline to finish it in 6 weeks. But most of the time, they want to ask for extension. But with the facilitators, we want them to stick to the schedule of 6 weeks, really forcing them to come with very different ways how to do it.
How would this work in a context where you have a execution cycle of a week? So maybe a good example would be the church that I work for.
Right.
We have weekly events. So we don't have time really to spend 6 weeks figuring out how to improve our services, because you have to execute and you have to implement every single week within that sort of weekly cycle. What might a 6-week sort of lab look like?
Yeah, I would
for
put it this way.
An organization like
so
this?
What you're describing is a routine of a church. I call that a routine of a church. The routine of a church means every Sunday you'll have your Sunday services and the subsequent things, the other thing, that's a routine of a church. In an organization, you'll have routines in an organization. Everything that you do in the organization, selling and marketing and doing that is a routine. But if I return back to step 1 in the church, and if I say, if your church had a workshop, and you define in your church in a workshop, let's assume that you say in your workshop, there are 2 true north for you. Let's assume. The first true north is you want to expand your membership from what it is, let's say 1,000 people are in your church, your congregation. You're now in a period of 5 years, you want to make that move to 500,000. So then the question is, what are the key priorities to move from 1,000 church to 500,000? I'm giving a very tall number. Then you would have to say, well, international activities to open more new churches outside. And which country? Then you have to say, you have to go to Indonesia, you go to Myanmar, you go to Vietnam. And so you start an expansion program. But if you don't have the pastors to do it as well, then you can't. So you have to have an activity, training and developing pastors to go and do it. So these are not your normal routine that I would argue about the church activities. These are activities that will help you achieve your true north from 1,000 membership to whatever, 500,000. And this is the thing that really causes you to move outside your routine. So your normal church activities will continue, but then you will have some other activities that are paramount to you achieving that.
Yes, but that still doesn't address how does a small, let's be inclusive now and not just talk about a church context, but again, maybe we can talk about small business where, we're a small organization. People who are the directors or HODs are also very much in the execution of stuff. So in a scenario where, let's say we were to allocate 6 weeks, 6 weeks where you spend a real concerted effort only focusing on the problem solving at hand and not really spending a lot of time on your other sort of day-to-day work. In a context where you maybe don't have the luxury of having a select committee to be a part of the lab and have the rest of your day-to-day continue to run, how might
Obviously,
you
I mean,
allocate the time in that sort of
you're
context?
You're right. If you have 5 people in a whole company, you can't get those 5 people to sit there and just focus full time on the lab and nobody's doing any work. Unless you really suspend the activities. Of course, you don't want to do that, because if you run a restaurant and there are 5 people running the restaurant and you can't let the customers want to come out, you can't do that, obviously. But we've developed other techniques that we did before. We call the virtual labs, that people can do it virtually and they don't have to be physically sitting out there. But that said, they have to give allocate time. So even when you run a virtual lab, people are not physically seated in a room, but they are virtually or working. You can do it, but they have to allocate time. And the way to allocate time is to say to them, you are free to use any time you want, time of day and night, but these are the tasks that you have to do within a specified period. And you let them have the freedom to do it any way they want to. And so they can talk to anybody that they like within the team to get input from others, but they don't have to bring them all together in a room. So you can do that. So we did it for the last time we did a very radical approach was for I was identified and nominated and agreed by the Minister of Higher Education, Dato Sri Khalid Nordin. He appointed me as the chairman of the Higher Education Policy Review Committee. And so when we did that, we wanted to run only 4 days of lab. But what we then did was, we didn't invite everybody inside the lab, but we sent out questionnaires for them to fill, which all the data that they have to fulfill. And once we got the data, we then used that. So we gathered all the parties involved inside the lab for altogether 4 days. And we were able to do it. So you can make modifications to suit the size of the organization.
So that's obviously a bit of a compromise. It's an innovation to allow the lab to take place in a shorter space of time, because we did this as well when a couple of years ago. I think it was one of the early examples of a virtual condensed lab where we did, I think it was about a 1-week lab, and this was for a fashion retailer, local fashion retailer.
I see.
It's, I suppose, still a bit of a compromise to do it in that in that fashion. And if so, maybe can you explain what might we give up by choosing to do a more virtual type of lab?
What you don't get out there is this. You don't get a lot of linkages in the interaction between the various departments because they're working virtually. There are a lot of assumptions. You make assumptions that that data is available from that organization or that group of people to give to me. But you have not really tested whether the data is available. But if you're sitting in the room, you don't make assumptions. You ask the person, do you have this data? The answer is no, I don't. What data do you have? I have that kind of data. Then you say, oh, I need this. This is the amount of time that I require to get that data you require. But a lot of assumptions are made when people are not together in the room. And the second thing that you do is that a lot of elapsed time is wasted, because you then seek the data of the input from the other party, and then they will have 1 week to get back to you. And maybe even a month they get back because they're doing firefighting. So you lose a lot of time, not because they're not giving you the attention, because they're firefighting and the elapsed time is the problem. But if you have in them the room, they have nothing else to do, but they're going to do only that. And that's why the quality time is important. Short, but quality time, dedicated time, very important.
Yeah.
You know, this idea of the lab, it was introduced to me very early on, Leon, in a very early part of my corporate life. If I remember correctly, in the 1990s, there was a bestseller, management bestseller, called Re-Engineering the Corporation. There were 2 individuals that wrote that book. There was an international bestseller, Hammer and Champy. So Champy set up and formed a consulting firm called CSC Index. And so there was a gentleman by the name of Michael Black. He was working as a vice president and partner for that firm. They came to Shell, Malaysia, at the invitation of our chairman. And he was the guy who taught us this idea of a lab. And so we found it such a refreshing way of working. People are working in silos. Shell is a large organization, and everybody was caught up in silos. So Michael told us, if you run the labs, you bring all the different divisions inside the room, there is no silos because they're all together in the room. In fact, he even suggested, if you're in HR, if you're in IT, if you're inside the lab, you throw away your HR hat, you throw away IT hat. But of course, if you can come with solutions that are HR and IT related, it's fine. But you can also give suggestions on sales and marketing, whatever you can. So it was fantastic. We did some really out of the box idea thinking during those periods, and that was my early exposure to the labs. The labs are wonderful ideas to break down silos and to get alignment. You get buy-in from people. And earlier on in the previous episode 9, that we talked about, you asked the question, or in step 1, you then said, someone criticized us for not involving me. How come you only involve the management team? The lab is when you bring in all the other parties involved. They are coming in together with you. They are the ones who come with the solutions. Marketing, HR, the sales people, the operations folks, the manufacturing team, the logistics people, procurement people, IT folks, they're all together, and the finance team, they're all together. And now you're really finding the folks out there looking for solutions. And they are the ones who are going to find the solutions, the way forward for the organization, not the top management. The top management only agree the true north, they only agree the key priorities, but the folks that come with the answers are really the middle managers.
Yeah. To that point, maybe let's return back to the genesis of PEMANDU Associates. Before you were a private consulting firm, you were a delivery unit within government. Now, the way that you had translated the lab into that government context of doing your national transformation program, economic transformation program, I think the lab was very pivotal in ensuring that these initiatives were not only planned well, but then executed well as well. And I think one of the key takeaways for the lab is the fact that in doing that, these are not just discussions held within different ministries, within different ministers, but you are ultimately getting both the public sector and the private sector in together. Talk to us a bit more about that.
Yeah. So in the year 2010, we came with the idea that we want to run economic labs. And the true north was to get the private sector to invest in our economy, and wanted to create more jobs. And we want to create a growth in our gross national income. Those were the 3 measures. So we invited 500 participants inside 12 labs concurrently. It was the first time we did in Malaysia, 500 participants from the government and from the private sector in 12 labs running concurrently. At the end of the 8 weeks, it was 8 weeks, and that 2010 was the exact period of the World Cup. And so people were complaining, Idris, and how come you're asking us to come out the day where the games being played? But it was very intense. At the end of the 8 weeks, 131 projects from the private sector were agreed and endorsed, and they had commitment by the private sector. They were going to invest 1.4 trillion ringgit of investment from the private sector. And that exchange rate at that time was $406 billion from the 131 projects. And that was creating 3.3 million jobs. The contribution of those 131 projects to the economy per year at maturity was $250 billion per year. And so it was really quite a radical thing. Never before in the history of our country were we able to get the private sector in a period of 8 weeks to commit $406 billion of investment, which is 1.4 trillion ringgit of investment for the 131 project. It was really quite incredible. It's unbelievable at that time.
And the key to why it's so important to get the private sector involved is to then negate the comments, the typical narrative of, but these initiatives sound great, but it's all coming out of taxpayers' money. Beyond that, are there any other reasons why it's so important to get the private sector to drive a lot of these initiatives?
the most important reason why we were of the view that private sector must be the engine of growth is because if it is not the private sector that the main engine of growth, who else can it be? It has to be the government, which is public investment. If it's the government investing in the economy, what is the consequence? It will increase our debt. The government has to borrow a lot of money to pump into the economy, and then our debt become unsustainable. So our view is that Malaysia must grow our economy predominantly based on the lion's share of the investment coming from the private sector rather than the public sector, so that our debt level is relatively small relative to the size of our GDP. And this is the road, I call it the road less travel. 90% of the high-income countries in the world follow the road most traveled. That means they reach high-income status by accumulating unsustainable debt. Only 10% of the high-income countries reach a high-income status by following a relatively low gearing level, but a very high growth on the basis of private sector. And that's why we wanted the private sector to come. And it will be not right for me to mention the reason why there was such huge commitment by the private sector. Normally, the private sector says this: yes, we will invest in this project provided the government does X and Y. They're conditional on the government doing X and Y, because they were saying, I'll build a hotel, but I'm not going to build a road leading to the hotel. Mr. Government, you have to do that. And you know, our electricity and water supply, that is to be provided by the Tenaga will have to provide that, and Sabas and others have to provide the water, not the hotel themselves. So in the case of Pengerang, for example, oil and gas, Dialog wanted to build a huge storage facilities in Pengerang, and so did Petronas. But they said, you guys, government, give us the land. You have to remove the 3,000 graves, but we are not grave diggers, they say. So you must do that. So we had to commit to do that. So it always takes two to tango. And some of them were saying that we will invest this kind of money if we get tax breaks. So the government have to assess whether the government is prepared to give the tax breaks. And if we do so, we said, yes, we'll give you the tax breaks, which is within our policy framework anyway. So, and I think at the end of the day...
And all of these conversations are happening in the lab?
In the lab. So we will bring, the Prime Minister is at the beginning of the lab, the ministers come in and out. So it's a very intense, we call it a hot house. They're very intense discussions inside the lab. And that's why we ran it for altogether 8 weeks.
I've been to Pengerang. It's a very impressive facility. We did a corporate video for Dialog, and part of the film, part of the video was shot there. The point you mentioned about digging up of graves, that would have been that's a rather difficult problem to solve. What were some of the lab conversations around that?
Petronas said we knew that there was a great opportunity for making Malaysia an oil and gas trading hub. They knew that, they said, but we have wanted the government to give us the land, but we were never given the land because we were specific, they said. We wanted the land in Pengerang because of deep water port area. The area is the big ships can come there. That's why we wanted that land. But they said we have graves inside the land there. But we cannot be the one to do that. You, Mr. Government, must do it. And so we had to find solutions. So in the lab, there were solutions that was available to deal with that. And so the graves were dug according to Islamic way for the Muslim graves. And then we had to make sure the compensation given, and particularly for the Chinese graves in particular. And they were very innovative. And I don't know whether we've covered in the earlier...
Why specifically for Chinese graves?
The reason, let me rewind the clock. The solutions originally, half of the 3,000 graves were Malay graves. The solutions that came out from the lab, the discussions were, actually it's not difficult to move Muslim graves, provided the Imam write a clear fatwa, step by step on how to do it. And so if you do dig the graves in the Islamic way that is compliant with that, then it's codified, then it is okay. That's how we got the Malay graves, the Muslim graves to be dug out and moved, precisely according to that fatwa. But of course, you can't do it for the Chinese graves, the other half. But the conversation was, the Chinese only understand the language of money. So the solution was, why don't we set up a new business in the Pengerang area? The government allocate a new area for anybody that in the future that die in that area, they'll be buried in this area. And so we then told the folks who said, if your ancestors who were buried in that area, if you agree for us to dig the graves and relocate the graves to this new place, you will become a shareholder of this new business venture.
Interesting.
Then immediately they say, okay, let's do it tomorrow. And that's how we were able to get acquiescence from both sides. That's where the graves were moved. By the way, they were, to be precise, 942 homes. We have to relocate them in that area. So we in the lab, the solutions was, we told Petronas and Dialogue, the government is not going to spend money, taxpayer money, moving these people, building houses for them. So if we give you the land, you have the opportunity to do that. But as part of the cost of doing business in this area, because we give you the land to go and do that, you now must build houses for these 952 homes. And this is specification of the house. We even told them exactly the size of the house, how many rooms there are. And we told the people who are living there, if you agree to be relocated, we will build a demonstration house. We actually built a demonstration house for them to see. When they saw the demonstration house, then they said, okay. So we actually built 942 homes to relocate all those people who are living in that area to move there. Done only where the space is given. Now, if you expect the private sector to be just doing that project, it will never happen. Because the private sector are not the guys who come and sort out these kinds of issues. And so that's how it became. But to make sure it is not part of taxpayer money, we say that this cost of relocating these people are totally borne out by the companies that were involved in this Petronas as well as a Dialogue. That's how we move them.
Very good. For someone who might be thinking about running a lab in their organization, if there were a few kind of key things for them to consider, what would it be? How do I prepare for a lab, and how do I conduct one well?
Yeah. First of all, you have to have a very good facilitator. And so if you need someone who can do a facilitation in Malaysia, just give us a call. Come to PEMANDU website. We have a lot of people who know how to do that. That's one. Secondly, you need to have the leadership to agree right up front. That's why step one is important. Do not run a lab if the leadership don't agree about this lab. Forget it.
Yep.
And so the third thing that's important is you need to identify who are the best and the brightest people that are multidisciplinary that you can put in the lab. Do not put up a lab and say, I'm going to put lousy people inside the team, inside the lab. So you have to identify some of your best and brightest people inside the labs. And so the fourth thing that is needed is that you need data. Do not go into the lab until and unless you have collected all the relevant data that's required before the lab. The worst thing you do is you run the labs and all you're finding out of the 6 weeks, 4 weeks are spent looking for data. So you have to get all the data that's required, all the information required. Everything is ready before you even begin then. And then the fifth thing you do is to make sure that there's a clear templates the facilitator is going to use for conducting the lab day 1, day 2, day 3. And the facilitator will give you all the toolkits that's needed, so that the analysis is there, the solutions are defined, the logbook is done on a daily basis, the deliverables. So at the end of the day, you get full outcomes. So the most important criteria for success of the lab, at the beginning of the lab, the CEO of the company, or in this case, the Prime Minister, must come to the lab. Or the relevant minister or the relevant manager for that initiative must come to the lab at the beginning. Halfway through the lab, in this case 3 weeks, again the Prime Minister or the Managing Director or the relevant minister or the relevant manager need to come in to hear the halftime presentation of the lab, to make correction, providing input. And if they are on the wrong track, correct them and provide the right steer. So, and give them encouraging talk.
And it's important that is put in the middle to
Middle.
avoid double work, because if you
Correct.
save that till the end
Then it's
and
too
you've
late.
already put in so much work,
Absolutely.
it's a lot to then have to revisit and change course.
Yeah. So you must have that. Then finally, then the minister or the prime minister said, I agree with this, I like this, and I actually don't like this, and I want you to look for something else. I want you to look for other things. So these are the areas for improvement. Now, the last day, at the end of the 6 weeks, the prime minister or the managing director or the relevant minister and the relevant manager must come there and hear the actual final report out. That's when you endorse. When we finish the lab, our requirement is we want a signature of approval. So you see the signature approved, signed by the Prime Minister, signed by relevant. In fact, at that time, we will bring in even more ministers, stakeholders, all the relevant ministers, all the chief secretary for the ministry, all the folks who are agreeing, they need to sign and they fully agree. The area they don't agree, the cities agree, we don't agree. It's marked the ones who don't agree and they sign in the agreement for a recommendation. This is the serious nature of this is because why we insist on such a rigorous documentation for approval is because you've spent 6 weeks of valuable time. The last thing that you do is to make sure, having spent so much time, that the folks out, they said, I'm just still thinking about it. You can't be thinking about this. People are taking this very seriously as if their life depended on it. They spend 6 weeks of their time doing that. So we tell the Prime Minister, in this case, the Managing Director who is there, make sure if you don't agree, you just say you don't agree. And if you agree, you do. If you don't agree, you should have said it at half time. So you must not take this lightly. This activity of a lab is an expensive activity. You have to take it seriously. But I tell you, in my view, and if you can run this, it's incredible the outcome. If I return to Malaysia, in 2010, we ran the labs. And we had $406 billion of investment from 131 projects. 6 years after the lab was implemented, every day and every week we're monitoring the outcome. By the end of the 6 years that we were implementing this, the total growth, the CAGR growth for our private investment was 10.5%, as opposed to only 5.5% prior to that. That means doubling the CAGR growth. And that is because the addition of these 131 projects that was put onto the other projects that were already running into the country really gave a booster in our gross national income by way of private investment. And to be clear, Leon, it wasn't just Malaysia that we conducted this lab. We ran these labs in many, many other countries, in Tanzania, in Oman, in Russia. We ran the labs in Lesotho, in St. Lucia, even in the Caribbean as well. So we also ran the labs in private companies. In New Zealand, we had an engineering company in New Zealand. We had a furniture company in the UK. We have 2 universities that we conducted and helped them conduct labs of this nature, and many, many more. So the lab's a wonderful tool that you can apply to really get the best out of people in the organization.
I think if there's 2 key takeaways for the why of doing labs. I think the first one is the ability to produce a detailed implementation plan.
Right.
So that's one thing. If you've got the proper plan in place and it is super, super granular, you're more likely to succeed.
Absolutely.
I think the other thing, which is also very, very important actually in why we do labs or any form of collaborative work, is the fact that, like you mentioned, don't bring in just kind of any old Tom, Dick, and Harry to do the lab. I think the real what makes a lab successful is getting the best people in the room. So in the government context, and getting the best from the private sector, best from the public sector, bring them in together. I think there's something to be said there about relying on the strengths of others. This podcast is ultimately, we discuss all things through the lens of leadership. So as a leader, I think it's very important to do that, because when you realize what your limitations are, you're better able to then nurture the strengths of others in your organization, others in your
Yeah.
team as well.
I
I like
agree.
this quote by Isaac Newton. He said, "If I've ever seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." So identifying who are the giants within your team and getting them to really drive innovation. Because when you are able to stand on their shoulders, it actually helps you to have a better view as a leader.
I like that, those 2 points why you run the lab. I would add one more. That's the buy-in. The lab's a wonderful tool for buy-in.
Absolutely.
If I think hard about it, and digressing a little bit, I think Nehemiah actually effectively conducted labs from a buy-in standpoint. You remember in the book of Nehemiah, the city wall was built within 53 days, and he made sure that every family who built parts of the city wall, they lived next to that part of the wall. There was the buy-in. Because the guy who was building the wall, if he lives in this part of the wall, and his family built that part of the wall, they cannot have to have a shabby part of the wall because they're protecting themselves. There was an element of buy-in. And that's how the book of Nehemiah is one of the boring books because it went such a long period identifying the names of every family that built the wall because there was an element of ownership. There was the buy-in element inside it. So I'm pretty sure they would have had a lab approach in doing it, and they didn't call it a lab because otherwise, how would they have concurrently built the wall without having a discussion? What's the thickness of the wall, the material that's used? They didn't build the wall in serial. Absolutely sure. That means that you build your wall, after you finish, then I build my wall. I think they did it concurrently. That means they would have an agreement about what is the type of wall that had to be built, what material to be used, and what speed of time we were doing. So I believe, in my mind, Nehemiah actually conducted a form of a lab.
And I suppose actually the Nehemiah story, Nehemiah also kind of answered my one of my early questions earlier about how do you put the time in to run your lab while also ensuring that you have the capacity for your day-to-day tasks. In this case, they were planning and building the wall while also having to defend themselves from attacks from the from the enemy.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. That's absolutely right. So wonderful.
Yeah, so buy-in is important, and I think again this goes back to the very reason why we are covering this this 8-part series, because we talked a lot about being in the first 6 episodes. Now we want to talk about how does that translate into action, and because implementation and action is so important, the lab really sets the tone for that. Because if you are bought in, ultimately your operational teams are going to be the backbone of your transformation journey. So if they are not bought in, if they were not the ones driving a lot of these ideas, it would be very difficult, I think, for them to be able to sustain the efforts in the long run. Or worst case, they don't even understand it to begin with, and you end up going off the wrong course right from the get-go. So I think this point of buy-in is so important for us to be able to implement and implement well.
I will give you a very powerful testimony and evidence to why the lab is such a potent tool to be used. In the year 2014, Bloomberg put me among the top 10 most influential policymakers in the world. I went to see them and asked the question, why did you put my name there and why not Obama? And the response was, actually, Idris, we're not really impressed with you as a person. We were just impressed with the methodology called the lab. They were impressed that in the year 2010, we were able to run the labs in Malaysia, and that we were able to garner $406 billion of investment. And not only were they committed, they were actually realized. They were looking at the actual results that were derived by 2014. In 4 years after we ran the labs, they saw that the results were really translated into the economy. So when they gave me the accolade, top 10 most influential policymakers, that's actually an accolade given to the lab, not to Idris Jala.
Very good. What can we expect in the next episode? What is your third step in the methodology?
The third step in the methodology is this idea of an open day. That means you're going to take the outcomes of the lab and exhibit it to the entire organization. You tell the organization, this is what we are planning to do. And we want to exhibit it to everybody in the organization. If you're in the government, you have an open day for the whole public. We ran it in Malaysia as well. So we invite the public to come. Whoever you are, we open day. So this is when you get mass support. So remember when we said, step 1 is about top management. Step 2 is when you get in the middle managers. Step 3 is the open days when you get a mass support for the thing you do through an open day. So when we cover episode 11, that is when we're going to talk about an open day. How do we get the mass support for the things that we intend to do?
Looking forward to that. Thank you for joining us on this week's episode of The Game of Impossible, looking at labs. We hope to see you next week. And if you haven't already, we would really encourage you to subscribe. It really helps our channel. We were just talking last week of how we hit 1,000 subscribers. So we just want to thank you again for those who have been following us, for those who have been subscribing, and to those who haven't already. If you've enjoyed these chats, please do subscribe. And you can follow us on our social media platforms as well. The Game of Impossible, both on Instagram, but also on TikTok. We look forward to chatting more next week.